Welcome to this series of lessons about Jackie Andrade's 2010 study about the effects of doodling and our ability to concentrate on our primary task at hand while we are engaged in aimlessly drawing or sketching something completely random. So, in this lesson, I'll give you a quick overview of Andrade's study, which is very short and the title is also quite short, just what does doodling do? But in the title itself, you will understand as I proceed with the overview that this is actually exactly what the study was trying to explore, but in relation to attention and memory. So first, let's look at a quick overview of the study. So this study is situated in the cognitive approach, and you should remember the cognitive approach has an assumption attached, has two assumptions attached to it, and one of those is that the brain is like a supercomputer with input and output, and the second one is that we have individual differences in our cognitive abilities. So those are the two main assumptions of the cognitive approach, but this study essentially focuses on exploring two key processes that are called cognitive processes or thinking processes. And if you remember, cognition, the word itself refers to thinking, remembering, problem solving, learning. And so in this study, Andrade was looking particularly at the cognitive ability to concentrate or to pay attention or to focus on something. And so attention and its relationship to memory, because when you obviously look at something and you focus on it and you concentrate on it, then you are more likely to remember it in the longer term. And we'll talk a little bit more about these two processes in detail up next when we look at the key terms. But in the context of Andrade's study, she was zeroing in on how this action of doodling, and right now you might be doodling as well, and doodling might look something like this for you. But doodling is essentially when you're listening, maybe you're sitting in a lecture, maybe while you're watching this lesson, you might be sitting and sketching and randomly just aimlessly drawing while you listen to my voice droning on about the cognitive approach. That's doodling. Andrade wanted to see if doodling, like daydreaming, actually deters us from paying attention the way we should to the task at hand, and hence does it impact our recall, because it impacts how closely we're monitoring the information that we're receiving. And in Andrade's study, she's looking at, does doodling promote inattention? Inattention is when you ignore certain stimuli around you. And we'll talk more about attention and then what it means to not pay attention, which is inattention. But Andrade tested this sort of concept of whether doodling actually aids our ability to concentrate using a laboratory experiment. And she conducted this experiment with 40 adults who were divided into two groups. So the design was, you had a control group and you had an experimental group, which was obviously the doodling group, in the sense that they were given a particular task that required them to listen and concentrate and pay attention, just like the other group that was not doodling, which was the control group. But the doodling group was actually given a sheet of paper with certain figures that they had to shade in and color while they were listening. And then both groups were tested for how much of the information they remembered. And while they were listening, they were also asked to write down some specific pieces of information. And together, this helped Andrade show that at least in this sample of 40 adults, of whom, by the way, many were women, doodling does actually seem to boost concentration or attention, and hence the people who were doodling had better recall or were able to remember the information better, and they were also monitoring more closely. And so this was essentially what the study did. And now we'll go on to look at some of the key terms that you may come across as we proceed through our series of lessons on this. And the first one is obviously cognition, which I was talking about just now. Cognition is that mental process of thinking, remembering, problem solving, and decision making. And when you're talking about all of these, you will probably realize that you are always also talking about memory and you're talking about attention. And memory and attention are both related to something called perception. And perception is how we make sense of the world using our five senses. So first, let's talk about attention. Attention is how we filter out information and we focus on stimuli or elements or information in our environment that is most relevant or most important to us in that context, in the situation we are currently in. So, for example, while you're watching this lesson, and if you are paying attention, then you're filtering out perhaps the sounds of traffic in the street. Maybe you're just listening to my voice and you are looking at the screen, and maybe you're also doodling. And so that brings me to the next term, which is doodling. Doodling is essentially aimlessly sketching patterns and figures, and doodling has nothing to do with whatever the primary task is. So for example, right now your primary task is to look at this video, to listen to this video, and to understand from this lesson what Andrade's study was doing, broadly speaking. And so that's what doodling is. Daydreaming, which was mentioned earlier, is essentially when your mind wanders, right? So if right now, as I'm talking, you find yourself thinking about what you're going to eat for dinner and how delicious it's going to be, and maybe you're going to cook for yourself, and maybe you're going to eat some pasta, some pizza, that's your mind wandering, you're daydreaming. And maybe your daydreams are more exciting because maybe you're thinking about your next vacation. But essentially, when you're daydreaming, it means that you're bored. And when you're bored, essentially you cannot focus or concentrate or pay attention to what's happening outside. Hence, you start thinking about other things in your imagination. And that's what it means by attention shifting inward. And obviously, if your attention is now shifted inward, whatever the primary task is, such as making sense of this lesson, that performance is impacted because you're no longer focused on the external stimuli around you. Then you come to cognitive load. It essentially, the technical definition is that your working memory, which is your short-term memory, is being used when you are making sense of the world around you. And the reason your working memory is used when you're making sense of the world around you is because, as I mentioned earlier, perception, your five senses provide a lot of information to your brain. And remember, the cognitive approach assumes the brain is like a supercomputer. And so through perception, or those five senses, information filters through into your short-term memory. Your short-term memory is then used to make sense of that information a little bit more, and then it may or may not be transferred to your long-term memory. So the effort involved there is the cognitive load. So for your purposes, just remember that whenever I'm talking about cognitive load, I'm talking about the mental effort involved. So that's a little bit more. Now we'll talk more about exactly how memory works. And before the processes are discussed, it's important for you to understand, first of all, encoding is all of that information from your five senses is perceptual information, right? So five senses, you have auditory information, you have visual information, you have tactile or touch-based information, for instance, and those pieces of information are then coming into your brain, and the process of encoding is how that information is organized and then placed within short-term memory. Now, if this is a little confusing, maybe think about it this way. You see this stick figure, and when you see this stick figure, you're thinking, what is this? And your brain then makes sense of what you're seeing and tells you it's a stick figure. Now, whether you remember this stick figure or not, that comes later. But you will essentially have this stick figure in your working memory or your short-term memory. Just remember that little piece, and then from the short-term memory, if this stick figure, let's say, is very significant to you because it's the cutest stick figure you've ever seen, and this is how you're going to make sense of the concept of memory, then it goes into storage. And storage, essentially, as defined here, is how you actually retain, meaning you remember encoded information over time. And then imagine that you're in a new situation where somebody asks you, how did you make sense of the memory model? And you say, oh, there was a stick figure involved. That's retrieval. That's basically when you are taking out all that encoded information from your storage, which is your long-term memory. So there's a difference between short-term memory and long-term memory. And when we talk about the study, we'll explain this in a later lesson in more detail. But essentially, the whole definition of memory is these three processes of encoding and then storage and then retrieval, where all of that together is referred to as our memory. So this memory is the sum of these cognitive processes. And remember that attention or concentration plays a role in what you remember and what you forget, because some information gets passed from short-term memory to long-term memory, but some information does not get passed to long-term memory. Now, the last piece here is incidental memory. This is also important because this was one of the things that Andrade was accounting for in her experiment, and it's an important concept because while you're listening to me explain how attention is so important for your memory, you may also be wondering, sometimes I remember things that I didn't really want to remember or wasn't trying to remember. So there's always going to be information that we say is unconsciously encoded, because remember that yes, the brain is a supercomputer, but there is so much information that is coming at us from everywhere, from all angles, at all times, that the brain is actually encoding all of that information, and some of that encoded information, and that's happening automatically, some of that encoded information just gets stored in our brain. For example, you may not be focusing on what color the t-shirt is that your friend is wearing today, but a week later you'll be like, oh, you're wearing the same t-shirt today again. And that is incidental memory. You didn't make a conscious effort to remember, but now you do remember because it just got unconsciously, automatically encoded in your brain. So these are some of the most important sort of terms, or the key terms that you should remember as we move through our lessons. And so next, we're going to start now with what was the psychology being investigated in Andrade's study. And remember that this study is housed within the cognitive approach. And as such, as part of the cognitive approach, that means that this study is looking at the role of cognitive processes or how they work in different situations. And so the first piece that you can talk about when you're trying to explain the psychology being investigated is the cognitive process of attention. So attention is your ability to focus on relevant sensory information. And so relevant sensory information, remember again, every time sensory information, it's information that's coming from your five senses. You have auditory information, which is when you're listening to information. You have visual information, which is obviously when you are looking at something. You have tactile information, which is the sense of touch. So when you touch a rough surface, recognizing it as a rough surface, paying attention to it as a rough surface, that's sensory information. And then tactile information. And then you have olfactory information. Olfactory refers to smell. So anything that you smell is part of that sense perception. And then the last of the five senses is taste. And so when you taste something, it tastes good, then that is obviously a piece of sensory information. If it tastes bad, that's also a piece of sensory information. But attention is how we focus on relevant sensory information. Now, because we can't possibly pay attention to all the sort of sensory information that's around us, as I had mentioned earlier, when you're listening to this lesson, you might also have traffic outside. Maybe you have a sibling who's playing loud music in the next room. But essentially, you can't possibly pay attention to all of that and also pay attention to this lesson, which is why attention is selective. If we had the ability to pay attention to every piece of sensory information around us, the supercomputer that is our brain would completely get fried. to balance mental effort, to balance the amount of information that's coming at the short-term memory in any given time, attention is usually always selective. Now, selective attention means that you're obviously focusing on the relevant sensory information at any given time, but essentially it means that you have to maintain a focus on the task at hand. But sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes you're just maybe getting bored. And when you're getting bored, that means you have a heightened state of arousal, you have energy that is not being expended. So, for instance, and it has an impact on your capacity to pay attention. So, when you're getting bored during a lecture, you're probably talking to a friend. And when you're talking to your friend during the lecture, your selective attention is on what your friend is saying and what your conversation is with your friend. You're tuning out. You're not going to be able to pay attention to what's being said in the lecture. Hence, there will be gaps in your understanding of the content that's being covered, which is why concentration on a primary task is a term that I keep mentioning. Because if you want to focus on a task at hand, on the primary task, then that is selective attention, meaning that you have to ignore other information that is not relevant, right? So relevant is really an important piece of attention, or rather relevant sensory information. So when you're driving a car, you must pay attention to the road. That's relevant. You must pay attention to, for example, check your rear view mirror to see if there are cars coming from behind. Check your side mirrors to see if there are cars approaching from the side. Somebody's trying to overtake you. If you don't, if you're texting, for example, your attention, your selective capacity for attention is now on the device that's in your hand. And when you're looking at the device, you're not looking at the road, you're not looking at the side mirror, you're not looking at the rear view mirror. And you are then more likely to have a car accident. So there are real life consequences also of where we focus and where we pay attention. But this is one of the main concepts within psychology that Andrade was studying. The next concept is memory that I've talked about very briefly earlier. So remember that encoding is the process of making sense of the information that is received, which is your sensory input. And so your sensory input comes into your sensory memory, and then from there it's encoded. And when this encoding is happening, the important pieces, the relevant, the new information, that's what is being made sense of. Once the information has been organized and made sense of, then it goes into your short-term memory. And it goes into your short-term memory or your working memory, it's further encoded and then put into long-term storage. Now, this secondary process of encoding, you might be wondering, if I've already made sense of the information, if encoding has already happened, why does it need to happen again? It needs to happen again because whatever this information is that has been encoded here at this point will then get matched to existing information in your long-term memory, and that's where you make connections between things, and that's how you essentially start to remember them for the longer term. So for instance, if you see this stick figure, you might remember this lesson on the overview and introduction in the psychology being investigated by Andrade. But it's a little piece of sensory information just that you may or may not remember. But there is a difference, again, between consciously remembering something. So you might be watching this lesson and consciously trying to remember the 3-step process of memory by Atkinson and Shiffrin from 1968. But it's important for you to know that this 3-step process, when it was introduced, did not cover this concept of incidental memory. But now we do account for incidental memory, which is where we remember things without a conscious effort. It's an example might be when you listen to some music on the radio and then you find yourself humming it later. That's incidental memory. You probably weren't consciously trying to remember the tune, but it got encoded and it came into your working or short-term memory, and something about it might have transferred to your long-term memory. And so maybe a month later you're humming something and you just can't place it. You've heard it incidental memory, things you remember without trying to remember them. I always say this, the human brain is like this really beautiful giant machine, and I'm always so impressed by how much information the brain can remember and recall and pay attention to, and so much of it is automatic. It's just, I think, one of the biggest gifts of being human is to have this amazing brain. But that's also me being like a psychology nerd. So I'll move on now. So this relationship between concentrating or concentration and doodling is the third concept within psychology that Andrade was exploring. So boredom, as I have mentioned a little bit earlier, is when all of your senses are in a heightened state of arousal, but you're not getting enough stimulation from the world outside you. And so when you're bored, that's when you're more likely to shift inward because your external environment is not offering you enough stimulation. So daydreaming is also called the spontaneous state of consciousness. Being conscious is being aware, but when we talk about the word consciousness in psychology, we define it a little more broadly, and we say that there are different states of consciousness. So for example, when you're sleeping, that's a different state of consciousness. And so daydreaming is a spontaneous state of consciousness, of awareness, where without even realizing it, you've got your mind wandering. So it's not intentional. It's a product of your being bored. So when you're bored, your mind will wander. You'll think about vacations. You'll think about what you're going to wear at your school fair. I don't know, whatever floats your boat. But when you're bored, you're going to daydream. And when you're daydreaming, the performance on whatever the task is that you're supposed to do gets affected. Now, Andrade felt that doodling could actually mean that attention is enhanced because that increased arousal, where you're not getting enough stimulation from the external environment, that can be addressed if you're doing something that's a low cognitive load activity. If you're just drawing aimless flowers and hearts, or like a cat. I really like animals, so you're gonna see a lot of animals in these lessons. Sorry, it's a very ugly cat. But anyway, when you're doodling, it's a way of increasing your focus and increasing your attention, is what Andrade thought. Why? Because when you're doing something that's low mental effort and still providing you some sort of stimulation, it helps you to focus on the actual task at hand, even if that task is a boring task. And that is why she felt that doodling can actually boost your performance on the primary task, because it deals with that heightened state of arousal and it prevents you from daydreaming. And so these were the three key pieces that Andrade was covering, where she was like, okay, we have attention on the one hand, and attention and memory are so closely related because whatever we pay attention to, and here again, I'll repeat, attention is defined as what we focus on in terms of the sensory information that we're getting. And so when you pay attention to something, then it is in your short-term memory, and from your short-term memory, if it is information that is very significant to you, or it's information that is important to you in some way, you're then going to put it in your long-term memory. But she was trying to figure out what are the ways in which our capacity to pay attention can be improved. And for her, the important, or rather the way in which attention and hence concentration or focus can be enhanced, especially when you're confronted with a very boring task, is to start doodling. So to improve attention, she felt doodling would be helpful. And this wasn't maybe just because she likes doodling herself. It was because doodling is a lower mental effort task. So because doodling requires lower mental effort or has a lower cognitive load, it will not take away from your performance on the primary task, but it will keep you engaged in the external environment and prevent you from mind wandering or daydreaming. So this is essentially what she was covering in this study.